In a world where judgment and cruelty often shape lives, one young girl rises above it all to prove that strength lies not in appearances, but in the heart. This is the story of Lucy, a girl abandoned by her parents, cast aside by a village, and labeled a curse. Yet, through every hardship, every tear, Lucy finds her way, turning pain into power. Join us as we dive into her incredible journey of survival, resilience, and transformation. Life Stories brings you a tale of triumph that will inspire you to never give up, no matter the odds. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. It was a cold winter's night in New York when Isabella Montgomery gave birth to her daughter, Lily. The sterile, gleaming white walls of the private hospital's delivery room stood in stark contrast to the turmoil in Isabella's heart. The delivery had been long, painful, and exhausting, but when the nurse placed the newborn in her arms, Isabella's anticipation turned to shock. The tiny face staring up at her was covered in a large, deep red birthmark that stretched across Lily's forehead and down her left cheek. It was an imperfection that would never fade, a visible mark that would follow her through life, marking her as different. Isabella gasped, pulling the baby away from her with such force that the nurse nearly dropped her. "Oh my God," she screamed, her voice filled with panic. "What is this?" The nurse, Maria, stood frozen, clutching the baby in her arms as she tried to reassure Isabella. Her voice trembling. "Señora, this is your daughter. It's a birthmark, it's nothing to be afraid of." But Isabella wasn't listening. She was too consumed by the horror she felt at the sight of her own child. Her eyes were wide with disbelief, and her face twisted in disgust. Her hands trembled as she clutched the hospital sheets, her mind racing with thoughts of the family's reputation, the Aldridge name, and the unbearable shame this child would bring. "Look at its face," she cried again, her voice rising. "I cannot, I will not keep this thing." Richard, her husband, stood by silently, his hands tucked coldly into his pockets. To him, the birth of a child had always been a mere formality, something to secure the family name, a duty to continue the legacy. His cold demeanor never wavered. Even as Isabella's panic grew, he glanced at the baby with indifference, his face hardening when he saw the mark. "An ugly child like this," he sneered, "carrying the Aldridge name? It's an insult." Isabella's heart sank as she clutched her head in despair. "We can't keep it, Richard. A child like this will ruin everything." She could feel the weight of their judgments pressing down on her, their coldness suffocating her as she fought to hold back her tears. The baby, unaware of the hatred around her, continued to cry softly, her tiny hands reaching for the warmth of her mother. But Isabella only saw a threat to everything she held dear. "Do whatever you must," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling with the finality of her words. "But I don't want to see it. Not ever again." Richard didn't hesitate. He waved his hand, dismissing the child as though she were nothing more than a nuisance. He called for Manuel, a trusted servant who had been with the family for years. "Take her," Richard commanded, his voice devoid of any compassion. "Make sure she disappears. Do whatever it takes." Maria, the nurse, stood frozen, her heart heavy with disbelief. She had been a part of many deliveries, but she had never witnessed something like this. She tried to protest, her voice filled with concern. "Señor, this is a crime. You cannot do this to a child." Richard's eyes narrowed as he glared at Maria. "A crime?" he mocked. "Letting her live with that face? Letting her disgrace the Aldridge name? No, that is the true crime." Tears welled up in Maria's eyes as she watched the helpless infant being taken away. She wanted to stop them, but she knew she had no power. Manuel, a middle-aged man who had served the Aldridge family for many years, wrapped the baby in an old woolen blanket and walked into the bitter cold of the New York winter. As he stepped out of the grand Aldridge estate, Manuel's heart ached with each step. He had been ordered to do something cruel, but his loyalty to the family was unwavering. He tried not to think of the baby's soft cries, each one cutting through the stillness of the night. He knew he couldn't take her to an orphanage, for Richard had ordered that no one should know of her existence. When Manuel reached the edge of the forest on the outskirts of the city, he hesitated. The baby's cries still echoed in his ears. But he knew he had no choice. He gently placed her on a large rock, her tiny body shivering in the cold. "God forgive me," he muttered, turning away as the baby's cries grew fainter. But fate had other plans. An elderly woman named Rose, who lived on the outskirts of the forest, happened to be passing by. Rose was a simple woman who sold vegetables in the town. But her heart was as big as her humble home. When she heard the baby's cries, she couldn't ignore them. With trembling hands, Rose scooped the infant up from the cold rock, her heart breaking at the sight of the helpless child. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice filled with pity. "Who could do such a cruel thing?" Rose wrapped the baby tightly in the woolen blanket and carried her back to her small cottage. She lit a fire in the fireplace, the warmth of the flames offering the only comfort the baby had known in hours. "You're safe now, my dear," Rose whispered, her voice full of tenderness. "I'll call you Lucy, a name that means light, so you will never live in darkness again." As the fire crackled in the hearth, the tiny girl, who had known only rejection, finally drifted into a peaceful sleep, unaware of the cruel world that had abandoned her. And in that moment, Rose vowed to protect her. Lucy's early years were filled with warmth and love from Rose, though the world outside their small cottage was a cold and unforgiving place. Rose did everything she could to shield Lucy from the cruel judgment of the village. But it wasn't easy. The villagers, steeped in superstition and fear, saw the mark on Lucy's face as a sign of bad luck. She became the subject of their whispers and harsh words whenever Rose took her into town for supplies. "That girl with the birthmark," Mrs. Marilyn would mutter, shaking her head. "She looks like a monster." Lucy, with her small hands clutching Rose's, would lower her gaze to the ground, trying to ignore their cruel words. She didn't understand why people hated her, why they looked at her with such disdain. All she knew was that Rose loved her, and that was enough to give her a sense of belonging, even in a world that didn't want her. But despite Rose's best efforts, the hatred and prejudice never truly left. When Lucy was old enough, she began to sense the coldness of the villagers. They would cross the street to avoid her, refuse to make eye contact, and always mutter something under their breath as she passed. Lucy couldn't escape it. She longed for the acceptance and kindness that the other children seemed to receive so easily. But for her, there was only isolation. At the age of 6, Lucy began to notice how the children in the village would laugh and play together, their joyful sounds echoing in the air as they ran through the fields. Lucy would watch from a distance, longing to join them. One day, she gathered the courage to approach them. The group of children was playing a game near the village square. And Lucy, her heart pounding with anticipation, hesitantly stepped forward. "Can I play too?" she asked, her voice soft, almost a whisper. The children stopped in their tracks, and for a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence. Then, one of the girls, a child named Marissa, spoke up, her voice laced with disgust. "No, we don't want you here. You're that cursed girl." Lucy's cheeks burned with embarrassment as the other children laughed. She turned and ran, the weight of rejection heavy on her small shoulders. She never asked again. Rose, always the pillar of support, comforted Lucy that night. "You are not cursed, my dear," Rose told her gently, brushing a lock of hair from Lucy's face. "You are a child full of light. People just don't understand you yet. Don't let their words define who you are." Despite Rose's comforting words, Lucy couldn't help but feel the sting of rejection. The years passed, and with them, the isolation only deepened. By the time Lucy turned 8, her desire to learn, to be accepted, had only grown stronger. She could read, albeit clumsily, the old books Rose had given her, and she was determined to learn more. The village school, however, was out of reach. When Rose tried to enroll her, the headmaster, a kind but weak man, backed down under pressure from the other villagers. They didn't want a cursed child in their midst, no matter how well she could read. One day, after hearing the other children laughing and playing again, Lucy made a decision. She would go to the school herself, hoping that if she proved she could learn, they would accept her. It was a bold step, but she couldn't keep living in this prison of rejection. With Rose's reluctant approval, Lucy walked to the school. But as soon as she arrived, The whispers began. A group of parents quickly surrounded her, blocking her way. Not her. Mrs. Marissa shouted. We don't want that cursed child in our school. She'll bring misfortune. The headmaster sighed, his face filled with regret. I'm sorry, Rose. I have no choice. The villagers won't accept her. Lucy felt her heart shatter. She had been so sure, so hopeful, that this time would be different. But once again, the villagers had won. She returned home with Rose, her small feet dragging in the dirt. That night, she sat by the fire, clutching a book close to her chest. Rose saw the sadness in her eyes and gently wrapped her arms around her. My dear, Rose said softly, you are worthy, more worthy than all of them. Don't let their cruelty change who you are. But Lucy couldn't help the pain she felt. Despite Rose's comforting words, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was nothing more than the village's outcast. The mark on her face, a symbol of her curse, would never fade. It would follow her, no matter where she went, no matter how hard she tried to escape it. In the days that followed, Lucy buried herself in her books. Seeking solace in knowledge, she studied harder than ever, determined to prove to herself that she was more than the village thought of her. But every time she left the house, the judgmental stares, the whispers, and the cruelty followed her, a constant reminder of the world's rejection. One day, Lucy's path crossed with Anthony Aldridge, the golden boy of the village. He was the pride of the Aldridge family, the heir to a legacy of wealth and power. He was everything Lucy wasn't, admired, respected, and loved. When he saw Lucy, his face twisted with disdain. Hey, look at this monster, he sneered, pointing at her. What are you doing here? Ugly? Shouldn't you be hiding somewhere? Out of sight? Lucy's heart sank, but she refused to show him her pain. She tried to walk away, but Anthony and his friends followed her, taunting her, mocking her. The cruelty in their words was like a knife in her chest. But Lucy knew she had to stay strong. She clenched her fists, determined to survive their hatred. You're nothing, Anthony said, his voice dripping with malice. You'll always be a nobody. Just like your mother. Lucy didn't respond. She didn't need to. Deep inside, she knew that one day, she would prove them all wrong. She would rise above their cruelty, and they would see that she was not the monster they believed her to be. But for now, she had to endure. She had to live with the rejection, the cruelty, and the pain that came with being Lucy, the girl with the birthmark. The girl they all feared. And as the years passed, Lucy knew one thing for sure. She would never let them define her. One day, she would show them that the strength to rise above it all came from within. As Lucy grew older, the pain of being rejected by the village only became sharper. Her longing for a different life, one filled with acceptance and kindness, never waned. Despite all the suffering she endured, she never gave up on the dream of proving her worth to the world. By the time Lucy reached the age of 10, she had learned to live with the cruel words and judgmental looks. They no longer struck her as deeply as they once had. Instead, she focused on her studies, on the books Rose had given her. The old woman, though frail and tired, was still Lucy's greatest supporter, constantly reassuring her that she was meant for something better than the life the village had mapped out for her. One cold winter day, as Rose's health began to decline, Lucy noticed her grandmother's increasing weakness. The cough that had plagued Rose for weeks now kept her up at night. Lucy could hear her grandmother's labored breaths as she lay in bed. The sight of Rose's frailty stirred something in Lucy, a deep sense of urgency. She knew she had to do something. Lucy, though still just a child, resolved to help Rose. She knew the village had no mercy for her, but perhaps she could find a way to earn money, to buy Rose the medicine she so desperately needed. She began knocking on doors, asking for any kind of work. The villagers, who had once seen her as a curse, turned her away without hesitation. What could you possibly do? They would scoff. A cursed child like you is no good for any work. Her heart heavy with rejection, Lucy trudged from house to house, her small hands trembling in the cold. She was determined, though, and refused to give up. She had to help Rose, no matter how impossible it seemed. But the world continued to shut its doors in her face. The baker refused to let her work in the kitchen. The innkeeper turned her away without so much as a word. And the villagers just kept muttering among themselves, shaking their heads at the audacity of a cursed child asking for work. One afternoon, in a last-ditch effort, Lucy made her way to the village's doctor. The man was known for his kind heart, and Lucy hoped he might be able to offer some advice or even some help. But when Lucy stood in front of him, her eyes filled with hope. The doctor merely shook his head. "I'm sorry, Lucy," he said. "I can't help without payment. The medicine your grandmother needs is too expensive." Defeated, Lucy returned home that day, empty-handed. Her hands were raw from knocking on so many doors, and her heart was breaking as she saw Rose lying there, pale and weak. Lucy sat beside her grandmother, not knowing what to do. That night, as Rose struggled to sleep, Lucy took her grandmother's hand. "Grandma," she whispered softly, "please don't leave me. I can't lose you too." Rose, though weak, managed a gentle smile. "You're stronger than you think. My dear, don't let the cruelty of others make you doubt who you are." But Lucy couldn't bear to see Rose suffer anymore. She couldn't sit by and watch her grandmother's life slip away. She needed to find a way out. A way to escape the crushing weight of rejection and poverty. The next morning, Lucy made a decision. She would leave the village. She could no longer endure the constant cruelty, the endless judgment. But before she left, there was one final thing she needed to do. She walked to the forest, where she knew Rose had always gone to gather herbs. It was a place of solace, where Rose could find peace and quiet amidst the chaos of the village. Lucy stood at the edge of the woods, staring at the towering trees, taking a deep breath before stepping into the shadows. She walked for hours, not knowing where she was going, only knowing that she could never return to the village. As she wandered deeper into the forest, Lucy's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She was leaving everything behind, the cruelty, the shame, the rejection, but she was also leaving Rose, and that was the hardest part of all. Finally, she stopped. Her legs were tired, and her heart was heavy. She knew that the life she had known was over, but in its place, something new was starting, something better. With a final glance back at the village, Lucy took a step forward, determined to find a future where she could escape the past. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she would not let them define her anymore. She was done being the outcast, the cursed child. Lucy was going to forge her own path, and no one could stop her. The world had tried to break her, but Lucy wasn't giving up. Not anymore. Lucy had left the village behind, but the road ahead was still uncertain. The dark woods surrounding her felt oppressive, the silent trees towering like giants. She was on her own now, and the thought of that weighed heavily on her heart. The bitter cold of the winter air bit at her skin, but the pain in her chest, the gnawing hunger, was worse. Yet, she refused to stop. She couldn't turn back, not now. Her feet ached as she trudged through the snow, her clothes thin against the harsh elements. She had nothing but a small bundle of belongings, including a tattered scarf and the few coins she had managed to scrounge up. The hunger gnawed at her insides, but she pressed on, determined to survive, to build a new life away from the scornful eyes of the village. She walked for hours, unsure of where she was going. The night was falling, and she needed shelter. She didn't know the first thing about surviving in the wild, but she would have to learn quickly. If she didn't, the cold would take her. Finally, as the night drew on, Lucy stumbled upon a small cottage at the edge of the forest. The door creaked open as she knocked weakly, her voice barely audible as she asked for help. The woman who answered was old, with wrinkled skin and a weathered face. Her name was Stella, and although she looked at Lucy with suspicion, she didn't turn her away. "I don't have much," Stella said gruffly, "but you can stay for a night or two, if you're willing to work." Lucy nodded gratefully, and Stella led her inside. The cottage was small but warm, and the fire in the hearth was a welcome relief. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, a place where Lucy could rest, even if just for a while. That night, Lucy curled up on the floor, the warmth of the fire comforting her as she finally allowed herself to sleep. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. The next morning, Stella gave her a few small tasks to do around the house in exchange for food and shelter. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Lucy scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and cleaned the garden. Every task she did with determination, knowing that this was her chance to build something for herself. In the days that followed, Lucy didn't just survive, she worked hard to prove herself. She was strong, resourceful, and determined, even in the face of constant hardship. She never stopped moving forward. She worked harder than ever, determined to make her new life something worth living. One afternoon, Stella approached Lucy with an offer. "I know a place in the village where poor children can get an education," she said, her tone cautious. "It's a long shot, but you could try." Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She had always dreamed of going to school, but it had seemed like an impossible wish. To be given a chance, this was her moment. She agreed without hesitation, and the next day, Stella took her to the village school. The moment she walked through the doors, Lucy felt a rush of excitement. It wasn't much, but it was something. The headmaster, a stern man named Mr. Matthew, eyed her with suspicion, but Stella vouching for her helped ease his doubts. "You'll have to work to earn your place here," he told her, "but if you're willing, we'll give you a chance." Lucy didn't hesitate. She worked harder than she ever had before, determined to prove herself to everyone who had ever doubted her. She cleaned the classrooms, washed the floors, and did every task that was asked of her. In return, she was allowed to sit in class with the other children, learning as much as she could. Every day, Lucy poured herself into her studies. The hunger, the pain, the loneliness, none of it mattered when she was lost in a book or solving a math problem. Education was her escape, her key to a future she had never dared imagine. It wasn't easy. Every day brought new challenges. There were still whispers, still cruel words behind her back. But Lucy no longer cared. She had found her purpose. No matter how hard it got, she would keep moving forward. 3 years passed, and Lucy didn't just survive, she thrived. Her intelligence outshone her peers, and she quickly became one of the top students in the school. Her determination had paid off, and with it came the promise of a better future. But Lucy knew that she couldn't stop now. There was more to do. There was still so much to prove. As she walked through the village, heads turned, and people whispered, but this time, it was different. They weren't mocking her. They were finally seeing her for who she really was. Someone strong. Someone worthy of respect. Lucy had begun to rise above it all. The girl who had been abandoned. The girl who had been called a curse. She was now something more. She was on the path to becoming someone great. And nothing was going to stop her. Her journey had only just begun. Years passed, and Lucy's life had transformed in ways no one, not even herself, could have imagined. From the lonely, abandoned child she had been, she had grown into one of the most respected and renowned reconstructive surgeons in the Americas. Her once painful past had become a distant memory, replaced by a life full of success, fulfillment, and purpose. One evening, as Lucy attended the prestigious Golden Hand ceremony, an event honoring the most accomplished doctors, her name echoed through the hall as the host introduced her. The applause was deafening, but Lucy's heart swelled not with pride, but with a quiet understanding that she had finally achieved everything she had once thought impossible. She had risen above the scorn, the hatred, and the bitterness of her past. Back in the small village she had once called home, the people who had shunned her now watched in disbelief. Lucy, the child they had cast aside, was now standing in the spotlight, a beacon of strength and resilience. The past, with all its cruelty, had not broken her. Instead, it had fueled her fire to succeed. The Aldridge family, once the pride of the village, had fallen. Richard had lost everything, his wealth and influence gone, while Isabella, once a socialite, was now nothing more than a shadow of her former self. Anthony, the golden boy, had been humbled by his own mistakes. He had been healed, but his soul would forever carry the weight of his actions. Lucy had forgiven them, not because she had forgotten, but because she had risen far beyond them. The only revenge she needed was her own success. And as she walked out of the ceremony, head held high, she knew the past no longer held her captive. Lucy was free. Please subscribe to Life Stories for more heartwarming and inspiring tales.